The morning of September 12th, 1944, somewhere near the Belgian border, a column of German armour sat hull down behind a low ridge, engines idling, exhaust curling into the cool autumn air. Inside the lead Panzer IV, Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann adjusted his periscope and scanned the tree line 300 metres ahead. His crew had been fighting since Normandy, and they knew the rhythm of American attacks. First the artillery, then the infantry, and finally, if they were unlucky, the Shermans. The radio crackled. Contact forward, American tanks, moving through the orchard. Hartmann's gunner, a veteran named Wilhelm, laughed. "Shermans again? How many is that this week?" "6, someone answered from the driver's compartment. 7 if you count the one that burned itself. They weren't being arrogant, they were stating a fact. Since June, German tank crews had learned to respect American determination, but not American armour. The standard Sherman with its 75mm gun was a known quantity. Dangerous in numbers, yes, but individually, manageable. The Panzer IV's long 75 could punch through a Sherman's frontal plate at ranges the Americans couldn't match. The crews called it the can opener. But today, something was different. As the first American tank broke from the trees, Wilhelm noticed it immediately. The barrel was longer, thinner, not the stubby 75 they'd grown accustomed to seeing. He reported it quickly. "New gun." Hartmann squinted through the optics. The Sherman's turret looked slightly different too, taller in the rear. But it was still a Sherman. Same silhouette, same high profile, same thin armour. He'd seen American attempts to upgun their tanks before. The British Firefly with its 17-pounder could be dangerous, but those were rare and easily identified by their elongated barrels. This gun looked somewhere in between. "Probably another American experiment," Hartmann muttered. "They're always trying something. Doesn't matter. Armour's still the same." The Panzer IV's commander agreed. American doctrine was well understood by now. Shermans were infantry support vehicles, not tank killers. The Americans relied on their tank destroyers, the thinly armoured but mobile M10s and M18s, to handle German armour. The Shermans were meant to fight bunkers, not Panthers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the German crews didn't know, couldn't know, was that the 76mm gun had been born from desperation, not doctrine, and its arrival on the battlefield represented a fundamental shift in American thinking, one that would cost the Wehrmacht dearly in the months ahead. To understand why German tankers laughed at the 76mm gun, you have to understand what they'd been facing since Normandy. American M4 Sherman tank arrived in Europe with a 75mm M3 gun, a weapon designed in the early 1940s to fight the tanks of that era. Panzer IIIs, early Panzer IVs, vehicles with 50 to 80mm of frontal armour. Against those targets, the 75 was adequate. It could penetrate a Panzer IV's hull at ranges up to a few hundred metres, and from the side or rear, it was lethal. But by 1944, the Wehrmacht had fielded an entirely new generation of armoured vehicles. The Panther, with its sloped 80mm frontal armour, the Tiger, with 100mm of vertical plate. Even the upgraded Panzer IV Ausf H models had thicker, better-sloped protection than their predecessors. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate any of these vehicles from the front. Not at 1,000 metres, not at 500, not even at point-blank range in many cases. American tank crews discovered this horrifying reality within days of landing in Normandy. Reports flooded back to headquarters. Crews described firing round after round at German tanks, watching their shells ricochet harmlessly off sloped armour, while 88mm return fire tore through Shermans like paper. One after-action report from the 4th Armoured Division was particularly stark. The crew fired 3 armour-piercing rounds at a Panther from 200 yards. All 3 bounced. The Panther's return shot killed the driver and set the Sherman ablaze. The psychological impact was devastating. American tankers, who had trained to believe their equipment was superior, now faced an enemy whose armor they couldn't scratch and whose guns outranged them by hundreds of meters. Tank crews began calling Panthers and Tigers unbeatable. Morale plummeted. Some units reported soldiers hesitating to advance when German armor was reported ahead. The Ordnance Department, responsible for American weapons development, was caught flat-footed. They had known about the Panther and Tiger since 1943. Soviet intelligence had provided detailed reports. The British had encountered Tigers in North Africa, yet the decision had been made to prioritize production over firepower. The 75mm gun had a superb high-explosive shell, perfect for supporting infantry. Changing to a more powerful gun would mean retooling factories, redesigning ammunition logistics, and retraining crews. And there was another factor. American doctrine, codified in Field Manual 17-10, stated explicitly that tanks were not meant to fight other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers. Shermans existed to support infantry, destroy fortifications, and exploit breakthroughs. Tank versus tank combat received less than a page of coverage in the manual. It was considered a special operation, something to be avoided whenever possible. So, when American tankers in Normandy radioed back that they were encountering Panthers and Tigers in every engagement, the response from higher command was almost absurd. Flank them, call in tank destroyers, use artillery, as if German tanks would politely wait while Americans maneuvered or requested support. But reality doesn't care about doctrine, and by early July 1944, the problem had become impossible to ignore. On July 2nd, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, forwarded urgent complaints from his tankers to the Ordnance Department. The message was blunt: our guns cannot defeat German armor. Men are dying because of this. Fix it. On July 12th, a special board convened at Bradley's headquarters to evaluate available weapons. They tested everything: the 75mm, the 3-inch gun from the M10 tank destroyer, even captured German weapons. The results were grim. None of the standard American weapons could reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges. But there was one option that showed promise. A new gun, developed 2 years earlier, but never prioritized for production. The 76mm Moan. Development began back in July 1942, when ordnance engineers recognized that the 75 might become inadequate. The project took the existing 3-inch anti-tank gun, which had excellent penetration, but was too heavy and cumbersome for tank mounting, and lightened it. Same bore diameter, 7 to 6.2 millimeters, but with a shorter, more practical barrel and a simplified breech. The gun used the same ammunition as the 3-inch, firing armor-piercing rounds at 2,600 feet per second. That velocity, combined with the projectile's mass, gave it significantly better penetration than the 75. Tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground showed it could punch through 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. Theoretically, that meant it could defeat a Panther's turret face and possibly the hull mantlet, but when the prototype was presented to the Armored Board for evaluation in 1943, they rejected it. The turret was too cramped. The gun took up too much space. And most damning of all, the high-explosive shell for the 76 carried less filler than the 75's. To infantry-supporting tank commanders, that was unacceptable. The solution came from an unlikely source. The 23 medium tank, an experimental vehicle that was ultimately cancelled, had been designed with a larger turret to accommodate a 90mm gun. That turret, with minor modifications, could fit on a Sherman chassis and provide enough room for the 76mm gun and its crew. By February 1944, the M4A1 with 76mm gun was approved for production. The vehicles began rolling off assembly lines in the spring. By April, the first batch of 130 tanks arrived in Britain, but they never made it to Normandy on D-Day. And the reason reveals everything about why American armor suffered so badly in the early weeks of the campaign. The decision to leave the 76mm Shermans in England was made by the division commanders themselves. They argued that the new tanks would complicate logistics, crews weren't trained on them, and most importantly, they insisted the 75 was good enough. After all, Shermans had handled Tigers before, in Tunisia and Italy. Why change now? General Hugh Gaffey of the 2nd Armoured Division was particularly vocal. He recommended delaying the 76 until the supply situation stabilised. Other commanders agreed. In their minds, the Sherman was an infantry support vehicle. If they needed to kill German tanks, they'd call in the tank destroyers. So, when the invasion fleet departed for France, not a single 76mm Sherman was aboard. Within days, that decision was revealed as catastrophic. American tank battalions encountered Panthers in the hedgerows of Normandy and discovered they were fighting with obsolete weapons. The calls for help grew desperate. By late June, even Eisenhower was demanding answers. Why weren't the new guns being sent forward? The 76mm Shermans finally arrived in France on July 25, 1944, the second day of Operation Cobra. 102 M4A1 tanks rushed across the English Channel and distributed to the 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions. It had taken nearly 2 months of bloodshed to convince American commanders that doctrine had to change. But even then, the 76 was viewed with skepticism. Crews complained about the weaker high-explosive round. Commanders worried about ammunition resupply. And the Germans? They saw the longer barrel and assumed it was just another variant, marginally better perhaps, but nothing to fear. That assumption would prove deadly. Because while the 76mm gun wasn't perfect, it was something the Germans hadn't faced before from American armour, a weapon that could actually penetrate their tanks from the front. The psychological impact of that capability, the shift from helplessness to parity, would transform the character of armoured warfare in the European theatre. But that transformation wouldn't be immediate. It would be earned, one engagement at a time, through brutal combat that tested both machines and the men inside them. Inside the factories of Detroit and Schenectady, the 76mm gun represented American industrial philosophy in its purest form. Not the best gun, not the most powerful, but good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, and supported by a logistics network that could keep it fed with ammunition even in the chaos of combat. The gun itself was a marvel of pragmatic engineering. Unlike the German 88, which required precision manufacturing and exotic materials, the 76 was designed for mass production. The barrel was a simple monoblock design, machined from a single piece of steel. The breech mechanism used components from the 75mm gun, reducing the need for new tooling. Even the recoil system was simplified, using standard hydraulic technology that any mechanic could service. The ammunition was equally practical. The M62 armor-piercing capped round was the workhorse, a hardened steel projectile with a ballistic cap to prevent shattering on impact and an armor-piercing cap to bite into enemy plate. It wasn't exotic. It didn't use tungsten cores like German subcaliber rounds. It was just solid steel, moving fast. At muzzle velocity, the M62 round carried enough kinetic energy to defeat 3 inches of rolled homogeneous armor at 1,000 yards. That was enough to penetrate a Tiger's driver's front plate at 600 meters, the nose at 400, and the turret face at 700. Against a Panther, the numbers were tighter, but the turret mantlet was vulnerable at close range, and the hull sides could be defeated at over 1,000 meters. More importantly, American ammunition logistics were reliable. While German tank crews often fought with whatever shells happened to be available, American tankers could expect consistent resupply. Every 76mm Sherman carried 71 rounds, stored in armoured bins with the new wet stowage system that dramatically reduced fire hazards. When those rounds were expended, more would arrive within hours, trucked forward by the same logistics network that kept American armies advancing even when German forces were stranded for lack of fuel. But the gun had limitations. The muzzle blast was ferocious, raising a cloud of dust that could take 30 seconds to clear in dry conditions. That meant follow-up shots were often blind, a serious disadvantage in fast-moving engagements. The longer barrel also made the 76 Shermans easier to identify, and German tankers quickly learned to target them first, just as they prioritized British Fireflies. And then there was the persistent problem with the high-explosive shell. The M42 HE round carried only 0.8 to 6 pounds of explosive filler, compared to 1.4 to 7 pounds in the 75mm shell. For tank crews who spent most of their time supporting infantry and destroying bunkers, that was a significant downgrade. Many commanders continued to request 75mm Shermans, even after the 76 became available. Yet, for all its compromises, the 76mm gun changed the tactical calculus of tank combat in Western Europe. For the first time, American tankers had a weapon that could kill Panthers and Tigers from the front under the right conditions. They were no longer forced to choose between suicidal frontal assaults or lengthy flanking maneuvers. They could fight. The gun's introduction also forced German tank commanders to change their behavior. Prior to July 1944, German armor could often afford to engage American tanks frontally, knowing the 75mm shells would bounce off. With the 76 in play, that confidence eroded. A Panther commander who exposed his turret face now risked penetration. A Tiger advancing across open ground could be hit from ranges that had previously been safe. This shift was subtle but profound. German armor, which had dominated American tanks through superior firepower and protection, now had to account for the possibility of being hurt. Tactics became more cautious, advances slowed, and in a war of attrition that Germany was losing, every delay mattered. Of course, the Germans had counters. By late 1944, improved armor-piercing ammunition for the 88 and the Panther's long 75 gave them range and penetration advantages that no American gun could match. But those advantages meant nothing if German tanks never reached the battlefield, strangled by Allied air superiority and collapsing logistics. In the end, the 76mm Sherman embodied everything that made American armor effective. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't invincible, but it was there, in overwhelming numbers, supported by fuel, ammunition, and replacement crews that German commanders could only dream of. And in the calculus of industrial warfare, that was enough. By August 1944, the 76mm Shermans began encountering German armor in numbers. And in those encounters, both sides learned that the rules of engagement had changed. Part 2. German tankers laughed at the 76mm gun script continued. The first major test came near the town of Mortain, where German forces launched a desperate counteroffensive on August 7, 1944. Hitler himself had ordered the attack, Operation Lüttich, hoping to split American forces and drive them back to the coast. It was a gamble born of desperation, and it threw German armor directly against American positions that included some of the newly arrived 76mm Shermans. The 2nd Armored Division, which had received 52 of the new tanks, found itself in the path of the German assault. Tank crews who had spent weeks fighting with inadequate weapons now had a chance to test whether the 76 could deliver on its promise. Sergeant James Bates, commanding a 76mm Sherman from Company F, 67th Armoured Regiment, was positioned on Hill 314 when the German attack began. His after-action report, filed 3 days later, provides one of the first documented accounts of the 76 in action against heavy German armour. At 0530 hours, observed enemy armour moving through the valley approximately 800 yards distant, identified as Panther tanks by the long gun and sloped armour. Gunner Corporal Matthews acquired. Target and fired 1 round M62 APC at lead vehicle. Direct hit on turret front. Panther stopped immediately. Smoke observed from hatches. Crew bailed out. Engagement time approximately 20 seconds. 20 seconds. 1 shot. 1 kill. Against a tank that had been considered nearly invulnerable just months earlier. But Bates's report also captured the other side of the equation. 2nd Panther returned fire. Round struck our turret at the mantlet joint, penetrated, Loader killed instantly. Gunner wounded. We evacuated the vehicle under covering fire from friendly tanks. The 76 could kill Panthers. But Panthers could still kill Shermans just as easily, often from greater range. The gun had given American tankers a fighting chance, not invincibility. Throughout the Mortain counteroffensive, 76mm Shermans engaged German armour at ranges that would have been suicide with the 75. Company A of the 3rd Armoured Division reported destroyed 3 Panthers and 2 Panzer IVs over a 2-day period, all at ranges between 500 and 900 metres. But they lost 5 Shermans in the same engagements, 3 to German tanks and 2 to anti-tank guns. The kill ratio was sobering. American armour was still losing more vehicles than it destroyed. But the ratio had improved. With the 75, American crews had often needed 5 or 6 tanks to reliably knock out a single Panther, accepting catastrophic losses in the process. With the 76, the ratio dropped to roughly 2 or 3 to 1 under favourable conditions. That might not sound impressive until you remember the industrial context. American factories were producing 2,000 Shermans per month. German factories were producing fewer than 300 Panthers in the same period. A 2 to 1 loss ratio was sustainable for the Americans. For the Germans, it was a death spiral. German tank commanders began reporting the new American gun to their superiors with a mix of surprise and concern. One report from Panzer Lehr Division, dated August 15th, noted that American tanks are now equipped with a longer, more powerful gun. Frontal engagements are no longer advisable at ranges below 600 metres. Crews are instructed to engage from hull-down positions when possible. 600 metres, that single number represented a fundamental shift. Before the 76, German armour could close to within 300 metres of American tanks with relative impunity. Now they needed to maintain distance, which meant slower advances, more cautious positioning, and fewer opportunities to exploit their superior optics and training. But the most significant impact of the 76mm gun wasn't tactical. It was psychological. For German tankers, the realization that American armour could now hurt them from the front shattered a crucial advantage. The Panther and Tiger had provided German crews with a psychological buffer, a sense of armoured superiority that made aggressive tactics viable even when outnumbered. When you know the enemy can't penetrate your armour, you can afford to be bold. When that certainty vanishes, every engagement becomes a calculated risk. Wehrmacht after-action reports from late 1944 reveal this shift in dozens of small ways. Tank commanders who previously reported destroyed enemy tanks at range now reported engaged enemy tanks withdrew under fire. Units that had advanced aggressively now adopted defensive postures, waiting for American tanks to come to them rather than seeking engagement. The change was subtle but corrosive. German armour, already outnumbered and increasingly short of fuel, now had to fight more carefully, which meant fighting more slowly, which meant giving American forces more time to manoeuvre, call in artillery, and bring their numerical superiority to bear. For American tankers, the effect was equally profound but opposite in character. The arrival of the 76 didn't make them fearless. They still respected German armour deeply, but it gave them hope. The sense of helplessness that had plagued Sherman crews since Normandy began to fade. They had a weapon now. They could fight back. Corporal Donald Burgett, a gunner with the 4th Armoured Division, described the difference in a letter home that was later published in Stars and Stripes. "We used to see a panther and just want to run. Now we see a panther and we know we have a chance. It's not a good chance, and we're still scared. But it's something. That makes all the difference. That makes all the difference, not in the physics of armour penetration, but in the willingness of men to advance under fire, to take risks, to press attacks, even when the odds were poor. Morale is difficult to quantify, but its effects ripple through every aspect of combat effectiveness. By September 1944, 76mm Shermans were arriving in Europe in substantial numbers. Roughly 40% of new Sherman production featured the longer gun, and divisions that had resisted the upgrade now requested as many as they could get. The debate over high explosive effectiveness had been settled by reality. Armor-piercing capability mattered. Men refused to go into combat with guns they knew were inadequate. But even as the 76 became standard, American tankers discovered its limitations. The most critical was penetration performance against the Panther's frontal hull. The Panther's glacis plate, the sloped frontal armor, was 80 millimeters thick at 55 degrees from vertical. That combination of thickness and angle made it effectively immune to the standard M62 armor-piercing round at most combat ranges. Crews learned quickly that shooting at a Panther's hull was wasteful. The turret was the target, specifically the mantlet and the turret face, where armor was thick but more vertical. This meant that killing a Panther required precise shooting. A Sherman crew needed to hit a target roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, often at ranges of 500 to 800 meters, frequently while under fire themselves. It was possible, combat records prove it happened regularly, but it required skill, steady nerves, and often a bit of luck. The Tiger was different. Its armor was thicker overall, but it was vertical rather than sloped. The 76 could penetrate a Tiger's driver's plate at 600 meters and the turret front at 700 meters with the standard round. But Tigers were rare by late 1944, and when they appeared, they usually had the sense to stay at long range where their 88mm gun maintained its advantage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The real breakthrough came in August 1944 with the arrival of a new type of ammunition. The M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, round used a tungsten carbide core in a lightweight aluminum body. The reduced weight allowed the projectile to reach over 3,000 feet per second muzzle velocity, dramatically improving penetration. With HVAP, a 76mm Sherman could penetrate a Panther's glacis plate from 300 yards and had a reasonable chance of defeating the turret front from 1,000 yards. Against a Tiger, the ranges improved even further. The ammunition was, in American parlance, a game changer. There was only one problem. There wasn't enough of it. Tungsten was a strategic material, needed for cutting tools, armor-piercing ammunition across all calibers, and various industrial applications. American stockpiles were substantial but not infinite. When HVAP production began, the ammunition was allocated first to tank destroyers, which were specifically tasked with killing enemy armor. Shermans received whatever was left. The first shipment arrived in Europe in August 1944, 2,000 rounds total, distributed across hundreds of tanks. Most crews received 5 rounds or fewer. By February 1945, the average 76mm Sherman carried 5 HVAP rounds alongside 66 standard armor-piercing shells. 5 rounds. For a weapon system that might engage dozens of targets over weeks of combat, crews hoarded HVAP like gold, using standard ammunition for everything except confirmed heavy armor. Tank commanders developed a dark humor about it. You get 5 chances to kill a Panther. Choose wisely. Despite the scarcity, HVAP's psychological impact was outsized. Just knowing that they had ammunition capable of defeating German armor frontally, even if only a few rounds, gave American tankers confidence. And when those rounds were used, they were often decisive. One engagement near Aachen in October 1944 illustrated the difference. A platoon of 4 76mm Shermans encountered 3 Panthers in a ruined industrial district. The American tanks opened fire with standard ammunition from approximately 600 yards. No penetrations. The Panthers returned fire, destroying one Sherman and damaging another. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Robert Shea, ordered his remaining tanks to close range. They advanced under covering fire from infantry, taking hits that damaged optics and external equipment but didn't penetrate. At 300 yards, Shea's gunner fired 1 HVAP round at the lead Panther's glacis plate. The tungsten core punched through, and the Panther erupted in flames as ammunition cooked off. The other 2 Panthers withdrew immediately. German crews had learned that the sound of American tanks advancing usually meant numerical superiority and supporting artillery. A single penetrating hit confirmed their suspicions. They broke contact rather than risk being surrounded. Shay's after-action report noted dryly, 1 round HVAP expended. Effect decisive. The engagement cost 1 Sherman destroyed, 1 damaged, and 3 HVAP rounds fired, only 1 of which hit. But the result was 3 Panthers retreating, 1 confirmed kill, and an American advance continuing. That was the 76mm gun's real contribution to the war effort. Not invincibility, but viability. American tankers could engage German armor without requiring overwhelming numerical superiority or suicidal close-range attacks. They could fight at ranges where training, tactics, and support arms mattered as much as the raw specifications of armor and guns. And in a war where American advantages were training, tactics, and support arms, that shift was devastating for Germany. By the autumn of 1944, the pattern had become clear to German commanders. American armor was improving. Not dramatically, the Sherman was still fundamentally the same vehicle, but incrementally, better guns, better ammunition when available, better tactics, and most importantly, there were always more of them. A Panther that destroyed 2 Shermans and withdrew was fighting a losing battle. Those 2 Shermans would be replaced within days. The Panther, once it ran out of ammunition or fuel, might never be replaced at all. Germany's tank production was in free fall, strangled by Allied bombing and shortages of raw materials. Every engagement, even victories, brought the Wehrmacht closer to having no armor at all. The mathematical inexorability of it drove some German commanders to despair. One panzer officer, captured near Metz in November, spoke candidly to his interrogators. "Your tanks are not better than ours. Your guns are adequate but not superior. But you have so many. We destroy 10 and 20 arrive. We knock out 100 and 200 come forward. It is not a battle. It is an avalanche. We are being buried under American steel." He wasn't wrong. By December 1944, American forces in Europe fielded over 6,000 medium tanks. Germany had fewer than 1,500 operational Panthers and Tigers combined, spread across all fronts. The numerical imbalance was so extreme that tactical superiority became meaningless. But numbers alone don't tell the story of why the 76mm gun mattered. The real significance lay in how it changed the character of combat. Before the 76, American tactics against German armor relied on overwhelming force and accepting heavy casualties. Tank battalions would mass their vehicles, advance under artillery cover, and use sheer numbers to close within effective range. It worked, but it was brutal. Entire companies could be shredded in minutes when German tanks were well positioned. With the 76, American commanders had more options. They could engage at longer ranges. They could fight from hull-down positions. They could trade shots without requiring numerical superiority of 5 or 10 to 1. Tactics became more sophisticated, more adaptable, less dependent on sacrificing crews to achieve objectives. This transformation was complete by the time of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When German armor launched its final major offensive in the West, it did so with many of the tactical advantages it had possessed earlier in the war: surprise, concentrated force, and local air superiority due to weather. But the offensive stalled in part because German tank commanders, conditioned by months of fighting 76mm Shermans, were too cautious. American defenders at Bastogne and Street Vith included several units equipped with 76mm Shermans. They fought desperate defensive battles, often outnumbered and surrounded, but they fought them with weapons that could trade shots with Panthers at realistic combat ranges. The casualty ratios were still poor. German armor destroyed more American tanks than it, or lost, but the ratios were sustainable, and in a battle of attrition, sustainable was all that mattered. By the end of the war in May 1945, American tank battalions had refined their tactics to a science. Mixed platoons of 75 and 76mm Shermans, with the 75s providing high explosive support and the 76s engaging armor. Close cooperation with tank destroyers, whose 90mm guns remained the best American tank-killing weapons. Aggressive use of artillery and air support to suppress German positions before armour advanced. The 76 had become just one element in a combined arms system that German forces could no longer counter, not because the gun was exceptional, but because it was good enough, supported by logistics, training, and doctrine that turned adequate weapons into decisive force. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the records told a story that was both simpler and more complex than the mythology that would grow around it. The 76mm Sherman had not revolutionized tank warfare. It had not made American armor superior to German armor, but it had done something arguably more important. It had made American armor viable. The answer lay in the combat conditions. The study revealed that most tank engagements occurred at ranges of 400 to 700 meters, often in terrain that limited maneuver and visibility. At those ranges, the Sherman's advantages, faster turret traverse, better crew ergonomics, higher rate of fire, and numerical superiority mattered more than the Panther's theoretical superiority. More importantly, Shermans rarely fought alone. The typical engagement involved multiple American tanks engaging from different angles, supported by infantry with bazookas, artillery on call, and often fighter bombers overhead. The Panther might be the better tank in a one-on-one duel, but armor combat wasn't a duel. It was a brawl. Against Tigers, the numbers were less favorable. Sherman crews reported that Tigers usually engaged from longer ranges, where the 88mm gun's superior velocity and accuracy gave German crews decisive advantages. But Tigers were rare. The study found that American tankers were far more likely to encounter Panthers, Panzer IVs, or towed anti-tank guns than the legendary Tiger. That shift in belief mattered more than the additional few millimeters of penetration. A crew that believes it can win takes risks, presses attacks, and exploits opportunities. A crew that believes it's doomed hesitates, withdraws, and dies. For the Germans, the effect was inverse. Tank commanders who had operated with confidence in June, knowing American guns couldn't hurt them frontally, became cautious by September. Interrogation reports from captured panzer crews revealed this psychological erosion. One Tiger commander, captured near Aachen, admitted, "We began avoiding American tanks when possible. Not because we couldn't defeat them, but because the cost of engaging had become too high. One hit from their new gun could disable us, and if disabled, we were lost. No recovery vehicles, no spare parts. Better to preserve the tank for a fight that mattered. Better to preserve the tank for a fight that mattered." That single statement encapsulated Germany's strategic collapse. When your most powerful weapons become too precious to risk, you've already lost. The 76mm gun's legacy extended beyond the immediate tactical advantages. It forced American doctrine to evolve in ways that would shape armored warfare for decades. The experience in Normandy shattered that doctrine. American commanders discovered that German armor appeared at every level of combat, not just in massed counterattacks. Tank destroyers, which lacked armor and were vulnerable to artillery, couldn't be everywhere. Medium tanks had to be capable of fighting enemy armor independently. The 76mm gun was the compromise solution. It wasn't the 90mm gun that Ordnance wanted to mount on the Sherman, that would come later with the M26 Pershing, but it was available immediately. And in war, immediate adequacy beats eventual perfection. By 1945, American armor doctrine had been rewritten. Field Manual 17-12, published in March, devoted entire chapters to tank versus tank combat, tactics, ammunition selection, crew training, all focused on the reality that tanks would fight tanks regularly and needed to be equipped and prepared for that mission. The changes extended to training. New tank crews arriving in Europe in late 1944 received extensive gunnery training, specifically focused on engaging enemy armor. They practiced identifying German tanks at range, selecting appropriate ammunition, and coordinating with other tanks in the platoon to achieve crossfire positions. But perhaps the most significant legacy was industrial. The 76mm gun proved that American manufacturing could adapt rapidly when necessary. From identification of the problem in July 1944 to deployment of over 1,000 guns by September represented a remarkable achievement of industrial mobilization. This philosophy, compromise and produce rather than perfect and delay, became the foundation of American weapons development during the Cold War. The M48 Patton tank, the M60 series, even the Monet Abrams all reflected lessons learned from the Sherman's development. Build something good enough, build it in numbers, and improve it incrementally based on combat experience. The 76mm Sherman was the antithesis of that philosophy. It wasn't the best tank gun of the war. The British 17-pounder was better. The German 88 was better. Even the Soviet 85mm gun had comparable performance. But the 76 was there, in the hands of crews who had ammunition, fuel, and replacements. And in industrial warfare, presence matters more than perfection. The gun saw service beyond Europe. In the Pacific, where Japanese armor was lighter and less numerous, the 76 was almost excessive. But Sherman units equipped with it appreciated the flexibility. The gun could fire high-explosive rounds that, while less effective than the 75mm version, were still adequate for bunker busting and infantry support. In Korea, the 76mm Sherman faced 34 85s, Soviet-designed tanks with sloped armor and 85mm guns. Combat reports from 1950 revealed that at typical engagement ranges of 500 to 800 meters, the 76 could penetrate the 34's frontal armor, and the Sherman's superior gun depression and crew training gave American tankers significant advantages in Korea's mountainous terrain. The 76mm gun remained in American service until the late 1950s, when Shermans were finally retired from frontline duty. Many were passed to Allied nations, where they served even longer. Israel used 76mm Shermans extensively through the 1960s, re-engineering them with diesel power plants and modifying them for desert warfare. But the gun's physical presence was less important than its conceptual legacy. It represented a moment when American military doctrine confronted reality and adapted, when industrial capacity overcame initial design limitations, when adequate, deployed rapidly and in overwhelming numbers, defeated superior but scarce. The German tankers who laughed at the 76mm gun in September 1944 weren't fools. Their initial assessment was correct. The gun wasn't dramatically better than the 75. It couldn't reliably defeat Panther frontal armor with standard ammunition. It had a weaker high-explosive shell. On paper, it was a marginal improvement. But war isn't fought on paper. It's fought by tired men in cramped steel boxes, trying to kill other tired men in other steel boxes, while artillery falls and infantry advances and logistics determines who can continue fighting tomorrow. In that context, the 76mm gun wasn't marginal. It was transformative. It transformed American tankers from victims of German armor superiority into competitors who could fight with reasonable expectation of survival. It transformed German armor from aggressive exploitation forces into cautious defensive assets too valuable to risk. And it transformed American doctrine from rigid pre-war concepts into flexible, combat-tested principles. The laughter stopped sometime in October 1944, after enough Panthers burned from 76mm hits that German crews stopped assuming they were invulnerable. By December, Wehrmacht reports no longer dismissed the gun as ineffective. By March 1945, German tankers in the Rhineland were specifically instructed to avoid engagement with American medium tanks when possible. By those measures, the 76mm Sherman was, in its time and place, exactly what it needed to be. Not the best, not invincible. Just sufficient, supported, and there in numbers that made individual losses acceptable and strategic victory inevitable. When the last Sherman was finally retired from service, military historians had already begun the debate that continues today. Was the Sherman a good tank? Should it have been better armed sooner? Did American doctrine fail its crews by prioritizing production over protection? The 76mm gun's story is ultimately a story about industrial warfare itself, about the triumph of adequate solutions produced in overwhelming quantities over perfect solutions that arrive too late or in too few numbers, about the willingness to adapt a doctrine when reality demands it, even when that adaptation contradicts cherished beliefs, and about the men who fought in those tanks, who learned to use their weapons effectively despite their limitations, and who won not because their equipment was the best, but because they refused to accept defeat. By the time they learned those lessons, it was too late. The laughter had died, buried under the wreckage of 1,000 engagements where American steel, good enough and numerous enough, prevailed over German steel that was superior but scarce. The shell that penetrated a Panther's turret on some nameless road in France or Belgium or Germany wasn't a miracle of engineering. It was simply a solid piece of steel, moving fast enough, fired by a crew determined enough, from a tank that was there because American factories built it and American logistics delivered it. That was enough. In the end, despite all the debates and analyses and counterfactuals, that was always enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.